Hello fellow translators. Today's video will touch upon something this is a question I receive a lot, and I've covered it in issues here and there, and I know in my course, but I thought it deserved a video by itself. And it has to do with the minimum charges. You hear about minimum charges, you see people use minimum charges, and you may kind of know what they are, but I wanted to cover it a bit more in detail as to what they are, what the possibilities and options are with them, and what the repercussions are when using them or not using them. So let's get into it. So first of all, minimum charge. What is a minimum charge? A minimum charge is an amount for which below you will not work. Let's see if I can say that not in iambic pentameter. A minimum amount is the minimum amount you're going to work for. And so what does this mean? This doesn't mean that it's a minimum rate or that you change your rate or anything along those lines, but it just means that you will not start working for anything less than an amount. I think the best way to show this is with an example. So let's say you have a rate of, I don't know, 7 cents. Let's make the math easy on me. Let's say 5 cents a word is your rate, right? And you charge 5 cents a word for your translations. That's fine. A client contacts you and they say, I would like this thing translated and it's 100 words. And you're like, okay, fine. Now, 5 cents a word times 100 words. Let's make sure I do the math right. Comes out to be $5, right? And so you're like, okay, I'll make $5 from this, and that's great. But then you have back and forth with a client, you translate the 100 words, and then they send it back, and then maybe they have issues with it. You have to go back and deal with the issues, and then they use it in their marketing campaign or whatever it is, and then maybe they still have issues, so they have a question. They're like, oh, we got something about that, whatever. Then you invoice them. Then it takes them forever to pay, and then they finally pay you the $5. And you're like, all this work for $5, was it really worth all my time and effort and energy to do this? And when I could have been doing something else. And certain translators decide, no, I'm not going to start working for anything less than, say, $10. And so what does this mean? This doesn't mean that they change their rate. The rate is still 5 cents a word. But if someone contacts them and says, I need 100 words translated or even 10 words translated, and the translator can say, okay, if you want 10 words translated, it won't be 50 cents. It will be $10. It'll be my minimum. So usually you say something like, okay, that'll fall under my minimum charge of $10. And then the client can say yes or no. So what does this mean? This means that anytime you actually decide to get to work on a job, you will be guaranteed a minimum of whatever the amount is, in this case, $10. This also means, however, that certain clients will decide, well, I'm not paying $10 for 10 words to be translated, and I'd rather find someone else to do it. And so you might lose out on a couple jobs. So you really need to see what works for you. And for a lot of translators, when they first start out, they'll do pretty much anything and the minimum doesn't matter. But after a while that they get going, they want to have this minimum because they want to be guaranteed a certain minimum rather than doing a lot of work for very little money. And the minimums you see tend to be, I've seen $5, I've seen $10, I've seen $20, up to like $50. I think $50 is a maximum I've seen for a translator, but there might be minimums that are higher, especially if there's a translator that deals with technical stuff or with medical translations or something like that. I don't know. But that's more or less what I've seen. And usually when I see a minimum, it's about $10 or $20 or something like that. And so this means that for any job you do, if it falls, you calculate the rate per word, and if it's less than $10, you will charge your minimum of $10. If it's more than $10, then you just charge your rate, and the minimum does not come, that is not taken in as part of the calculation. It's not like you start at the minimum and then it becomes higher based on that. No. So what does this mean? This means if I charge 5 cents a word and someone wants me to translate, say, 200 words, right? 200 words times 5 cents a word means $10 if I'm doing the math correctly. Now, $10 is my minimum, right? So that would fall directly in my minimum. If they ask me anything less than 200 words, it's still $10. But if they ask me more than 200 words, if they ask me 201 words, then it's $10.05. It's not like I start at $10 and then it becomes higher or anything like that. And so you only take the minimum into account when the total amount would fall below the minimum. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know in the comments and I can try to explain by writing it down or with an example or something. But that's how minimums work. Now, there are other options you can do. You can have a minimum per month. And this works with clients that you might have on a regular or semi-regular basis. And so what do you do in this case? You can say, I have a minimum of $10 per month. So if they have one translation that is only 10 words, but then they have another translation that's a lot larger, well, guess what? You'll end up charging just per word, and you'll just add on those 10 words, which will be 50 cents, onto the other thing. And the minimum amount doesn't come into play because it's minimum per month. And yeah, again, regular clients might be fine with that. They'll say, okay, then as long as we hire you in any month, we need to pay you $10 for that month, at least $10 for that month. And that's fine because we give you enough regular work that seems like it'll fit in. And so there are various options you can do. And so you can kind of play around with it and see what works for you. My only recommendation is to make it very clear with the client, ideally ahead of time, but at least once they hire you for a certain job, say this falls under my minimum, it will be my minimum. You don't want to wait until you invoice them for them to discover that you have a minimum. So you want to make it very clear, even if you have to repeat it for several jobs or stuff like that, make sure they know it's your minimum. And in fact, usually it's for every job. You confirm, you say, okay, this will fall under my minimum. And so they know ahead of time. And the other thing is not to complicate your life too much, because another option you can do is decide that I'm only going to apply this minimum to new clients, and for my old clients, I'll keep the old one, which is fine. But then you really need to keep track of who gets charged your minimum and who doesn't and whatnot, because it can become very complicated after a while. So make sure you have it under control. But otherwise, the minimum charge can be a useful thing to make sure that you're not taking up a lot of time to earn 50 cents, and rather that you make sure that anytime you start working on something, you're guaranteed a minimum. And by the way, I've seen this mainly with people when they translate stuff like certificates, birth certificates, driver's license, stuff like that. Because very often these don't have many words, but they still require the work. And even if they're kind of formulaic and they're kind of similar to each other, they still require work. You have to go back and forth and you have to invoice the client, et cetera, et cetera. And so very often people will say, okay, that'll fall under my minimum charge of whatever it is. And so feel free to try it, feel free to do it. And just know that it's an option that's available for you to have this minimum charge, so you don't suddenly find yourself having to do all this stuff and rigmarole and invoicing clients for 4 translated words, and it's not worth it, and you wonder what the hell you're doing. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully you find this useful in terms of minimum charge. If you have other details you'd like to know about minimum charges or anything, feel free to let me know, or if something wasn't clear in what I explained. But otherwise, I hope you find this useful, and that's about it. I'll talk to you next time. Okay, thanks. Bye. Savedum.